And we're so delighted to have with us Don McPherson, All-American quarterback, advocate, activist. Don, it's great to be with you. It's great to see you.
Great to see you too, Brian. Absolutely.
So, Don, we love your new book, The Blind Spot of Masculinity. And I'm really curious to learn more about this in terms of the name of this topic here, Matters That Matter.
Yeah.
When did this matter of masculinity start mattering to you?
You know, what's interesting is that I learned about gender and masculinity as it relates to men's violence against women in 1994, so close to 25 years, that I learned from a guy named Jackson Katz, who many people know as this great activist and educator and feminist. And even though that's when I first was able to truly understand it and contextualize it, it was always something that I struggled with. It was always, I talk a lot in the book about my experience at Syracuse, where I was the quarterback of the football team, and everyone thought I was the man. Everyone thought I was this tough guy, this whatever connotation comes across with being the All-American football player. And those things did not resonate with me. I just was never that kind of guy. And so I knew I was part of that performance. And so in 94, when I learned from Jackson Katz all about the constructs, the social constructs of masculinity, I was able to recognize so many places in my life that I struggled. And so the matter of masculinity was something that I learned formally 25 years ago, but I can tell you that it's something that throughout my entire life, I always saw those points when I didn't live up to what masculinity was asking me to be.
So Don, you travel all over the country, visiting colleges, visiting universities, speaking about masculinity. I'm curious, what are some of the differences you see about being a male university student today versus being a male university student, let's just say a couple years ago?
If you want to go back to when and what's amazing is that so much has changed, and yet so many things are still the same. The expectations and the responsibility that men have to engage in conversations around sexual violence prevention, not so much masculinity, but sexual violence and domestic violence prevention and awareness has obviously been raised exponentially. That's a very good thing. But what hasn't changed is the level of real talk amongst men. And that it's changed some, but not on a broad scale. It's changed in clubs and groups. Like at Syracuse, we had a men's issue for a number of years, a group of men who were talking about examining masculinity, but they were doing so in the context, once again, of violence against women. And what hasn't changed is a real robust conversation among men, with and among men, about what it means to be a whole, loving, caring. That's the aspirational masculinity, about what it really means to be a whole man. And that dialogue that has not happened puts a lot of young men in a very vulnerable place, because we're being asked to live up to a higher standard of being a man in terms of sexual harassment in the workplace and language and all the things that we're supposed to know and do, but we're not having that conversation for ourselves. So we're not able to internalize what those messages and what those mandates look like.
I love in your book, and some of the things we've talked about, is that when you're growing up as a young boy, one of the worst things that you can be told is that, you throw like a girl, right? You cry like a girl. We get taught how to not be like girls rather than being taught how to be men. And I love what you said here about aspirational masculinity, this sense of, we shouldn't be ashamed to be men, and we should lean into that and lean into that. What is the anatomy, if you will, the anatomy of aspirational masculinity? What does that look like to you?
You bring up that point about how we raise boys, and I always say, and probably one of the things I get quoted on most outside of the book, is that we don't raise boys to be men, we raise boys not to be women. And we're always telling boys what not to be. And I really came to that from talking with a man quite many years, my senior, several years ago. And he said all those things. When I said, what does it mean to be a man? It's don't be this, don't cry, don't be a sissy, don't let him see, remember that old ad, don't let him see you sweat. All those kinds of don'ts is what got me to that statement. And what it made me realize is that we're lacking a real honest and complete conversation with boys about what it means to be a whole man. We say things like, there's this exercise that was created by the Open Men's Project back in the 70s. It's a great tool for a lot of people. It's called the box exercise, the man box. I call it the box of masculinity. It's all about the narrowness of masculinity. Be tough, be strong, don't cry. And we've always talked about getting men outside of that, breaking outside of the box, as many people say. Think outside the box, as many people will say. But I think of the box as a toolbox. And if you only have in that box, be tough, strong, don't cry, it's very limited. You have very few tools. We have to teach that we also have in our toolbox. I always tell people, how many of you have a toolbox at home and you have like 3 tools that you use, the hammer, the screwdriver, and duct tape, right? Meanwhile, you're carrying around this box that has all other kinds of tools that we just don't use. And so for men, our empathy, our emotions, our sensitivity, our vulnerability, those tools that we don't regularly use and practice, we don't know how to. And so that's part of the aspirational masculinity, is teaching men how to use all of those tools in the toolbox, to recognize them, to embrace them, to not see them as weakness, but to see them as strengths that we have at our disposal to help us navigate through life.
So you bring up some good points. I'm thinking about the situation that you and I are finding ourselves in, right? We're in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. We're thinking about all these changes. And when I think about disruption, I think about this moment where we reflect a little bit deeper upon our identity and our purpose. And in my world at the chapel, who is God created me to be, and what is it that God is calling me to do? And I'm curious, Don, in the midst of this crisis, in the midst where so many men are now hanging out at home for they didn't expect this. I'm wondering just your reflections around masculinity and identity and purpose. How has that changed in the midst of this crisis that we now find ourselves in? Or what has this crisis helped you to reflect on in terms of your book and in new ways?
There's so many things. And I think about personally, in my personal business, I should say, that my job and the work that I do has always been around being around people and being in large groups. I mean, right before everything shut down, right before the economy shut down, I was in Atlantic City for 3 days at an event, and then I was in your home state. I was in Green Bay,
yes.
At St. Norbert's College there for 3 days, and saw close to 1,000 people between local businesses and folks on campus. It was a lovely few days, but there I was. And 2 days later, that campus shut down, and not knowing when that's going to happen again. And when people come back, are they going to fill auditoriums to hear Don McPherson come speak? And so many of us who have lived in a kind of rhythm of life that has changed and don't know when it's going to change back or if it's going to change back. And so there's a level of uncertainty that for, whether I don't consider myself a type A personality, but for people who are used to living by a certain rhythm and having a certain thing that they do taken away, what does that do to your identity? And I think what exacerbates that even more so for men is our identity is so often wrapped up into what we do. What do you do for a living? And how much of that identity has been taken away from so many men, not just people like myself who go out and speak and get on planes, but the everyday people whose lives have been shut down and disrupted by this. And I think what's really got me thinking about that identity, when you take that away from a man, not only does he have to sort of rethink, like I have to recalibrate, what does this look like? He has to rethink what are those things that make me confident and self-assured and competent that I do. And then when you layer on top of that the role that men play in the family, and I always think about when I get to travel, that's my quiet time. That's my time out of the home. That's my time away. And so many people, they go to the office, and there is, for a lot of men who don't know how to deal with the day-to-day emotions of raising children, the day-to-day emotions of being in a relationship, the day-to-day, all those things, the office and going to work is a respite from that. Yeah. And so now that's been taken away. And so now you have men who are in with their families and having to navigate, and especially, whatever stage your children in, if you're in that situation, having to navigate those things that you're not always there for, to be a part of. And so how do you help your children navigate some of the things that they may be going through? And you can almost get to a point where you are a little useless as a man, right? And have to come to terms with that. You really aren't that necessary in certain aspects of your family's lives. And so what does that do to you psychologically and emotionally? And so, there's so many things that are going on right now for men, wrapped around this ability to work and, once again, to pay bills. All of a sudden I can't pay bills. All of a sudden I have to talk to a bill collector or talk to a mortgage company and say, I'm sorry, I can't make my payment this month. And how much humility do we have? Again, in that box of masculinity, in that box of identity, our humility, our vulnerability. How do we deal with that when we've never had to really deal with it? We've always had to mask it. It's a great film, The Mask You Live In, about men masking their emotions. Well, now we no longer have that mask.
You bring up, and you'll appreciate this metaphor as a all-American quarterback. And I think about playing out of position, that you trained to be a quarterback and you did it really well. And all of a sudden, coach shows up one day and says, look, I'm putting you at strong safety.
Right.
So now, of course, there's certain things you've been around the game long enough to know, okay, but you didn't train for that. You're playing out of position. And the way that I think about not just what men are being called upon to do, but of course, women, children, grandparents, everyone, it just seems to me that we're living at this time where everybody is being called upon to play out of position. They're called upon to play positions that they did not train for. And it's forcing us to ask all these different questions around how is it that I function, in that vulnerability, like you're saying. Yeah. Could you respond to that? It just seems to me like that's the metaphor that's on my mind these days.
No, it's a good one. And I will tell you that, we just had the NFL draft earlier last week, and I was a quarterback. People say I was a football player. I was a quarterback. And a lot of teams in the NFL wanted me to switch positions. And I held true to being a quarterback. And people say, oh, because you were black and you wanted to prove the black quarterback. No, I can't play those other positions. I can't do those things. And not that I wasn't trained, I just can't do those things. And so I think that, the thing, and Brian, you and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. I don't like the framing of this as a war, the battle against COVID, because then it means that we have to use those same skills, right? If all I can do is be a quarterback, then I know what war looks like for a quarterback. I'm going to use those skills. But this is not a war. This is really something that because in a war we have an enemy. We see the enemy. We know what the enemy is, and we know what we do with it. We beat the enemy down. Right now, the enemy, and for so many of us, is that vulnerability. Is I feel healthy, but maybe I'm asymptomatic with this virus. So it means I have to sacrifice going out so I don't infect someone else. So we can flatten the curve and do all those things that we're being told by the health professionals around the world, that we need to keep this socially distanced. That requires sacrifice. That requires that I don't go out and play basketball. That requires that I don't go out for that run or that walk that I typically do in the park. It requires that in order for me to care about other people. And that's what this is. This is not a war. This is a moment that we step up and show a different kind of love for our fellow human beings. And that different kind of love means the things that we're so used to doing in our own selfish way, that we stop doing those things. I've been locked up for 45 days. I'm a guy who I haven't spent 45 days in one place since I was an infant. And that means that I no longer do those things. And so I do that not because, and I've been healthy. I travel all over prior to this. I've been healthy, and God willing, I will remain that way. But I'm going to remain that way by staying home and sacrificing so many of those things that I'm used to doing on a daily basis. And so I think even the framing around how do we love each other, how do we care for each other, means not just that we hand somebody something, but that we actually make a sacrifice in our own selves.
Mm-hmm. I was talking to my wife. You know my wife, Kristen. Kristen was a Division I athlete as well. I am a distant second in terms of athletic ability in the Konkol household. And one of the things we were talking about was about the lessons that being a student athlete carry for us in this time. She wrote an article about it recently, and one of them was, we know how to celebrate the wins. We know how to celebrate the wins. In addition to that, we know how to work as a team. We know how to set new goals. We know how to learn from the losses. But I've been thinking a lot about how do we celebrate the wins when it just seems like we're surrounded by losses. When I think about COVID-19 and what so many people are losing, but also when I think about your work, Don, and about it's so easy to focus on the setbacks, and we think about there's no shortage of examples for non-aspirational masculinity.
Right.
I'm curious, you've been doing this for a while now. What are some of the wins that you've seen in your work when you think about helping men to be better men? What are some of the wins?
When I first started doing this work, and it's an excellent question, Brian. I think one that's really important in this moment, because we feel the anxiety of this moment, like this is it. This feels very desperate and difficult. When I first started doing this work in the mid-'90s and learned about the vastness of this problem of men's violence against women and the kind of masculinity that leads to it, it felt very daunting. And I would always tell people, it feels like a tidal wave is coming and I've got a shovel that holds 1 grain of sand, right? So do I become part of the tidal wave, or do I start shoveling? And there's that old, message of the frog in the boiling water, right? If you put that frog in that water that's room temperature, might not notice the rise in temperature. So you have to really look at things longitudinally. And I used to always say that I was in the business of putting myself out of business. And that meant that there were more people talking about this issue of men's violence against women and masculinity, and those numbers of violence against women are coming down. And the other thing that you recognize at that time is that the more awareness you raise, the more the problem's going to feel like it appears. It's just like testing right now with COVID. The more that we test, the more positives we're going to see. It's going to feel more drastic than perhaps it actually is, but because we know more about the problem. And so over the last 25 years of doing this work, the victory that I do kind of take, and I don't own it, but I do celebrate part of it, is that there are more people talking about this issue than ever before. When I first wrote this book in 2002, I was on Oprah. I always describe the Oprah as, you get a car, that Oprah, right? When she was at her peak in her heyday. And she gave me the name of a publisher while I was on the set with her, because I threw out that I was writing this book. And she gave me the name of that publisher rejected the book within a week. The rejection letter from that publisher is in my book now. And it's in my book now because I talked about 25 years ago or 20 years ago, people didn't want to talk about this. And now there are many books about this. There are many more people talking about this. My book that I wrote 20 years ago has now been published, which means that we're moving in a direction where we're more open to the conversation. And I will tell you that in addition to seeing that longitudinal change, many more men doing the work, hopefully the numbers of violence against women coming down. That's the ultimate goal, including this new conversation around aspirational masculinity for men. I get now, moments. I was at a school a few months ago, and after the talk, I got an email about 2:00 in the morning from a student, and a male student. And he said, he went back to his dorm, and he was able to confront all of his dorm mates. There were 4 of them in there, I guess, in their suite. And they had a conversation about all the different things they do as men, as they do to each other that I talked about in the lecture. And I think that's the other thing that happens. Because of social media, because of our ability to talk with one another, you hear those successes. You hear people saying, hey, you know what, a light bulb went on for me. Or this enabled me to have a conversation with my dad that I was never able to have before. Those little ones, I take those. I dance in the hotel room by myself when I hear those things that affirm that what you did mattered.
And just as a side note here, to those that are tuning in here on Facebook Live, we're trying to take some questions. So if you do have some questions, please feel free to put them into the comment section. Remember, I was trained as a Lutheran minister, not as a conversation host. So we're going to do our best to get to those as best as we can. We believe in forgiveness. So if I don't get to your question, please do forgive. So. And those will get to me here. Don, one question that did come in from our Facebook here is around how have women approached you and responded to your work? When women approach you and say, Don, this is what I think about your work, what's some of the feedback that you're getting from women?
Appreciation for saying things out loud. I think that I learned early on that people would always say that when I first started doing the work, that people say, oh, women don't want men in this conversation. And I've never experienced that. I've never had one day a woman say that the voice of men in this work is not necessary or not needed. I know that there are women who will always feel like, well, he's just saying the same thing that women have been saying for decades. Exactly. And that's exactly where I learned from. And I've been blessed to be around women who have challenged me. Women have set me straight when I was wrong. And those things happen often. And being able to be courageous in the dialogue to say I'm wrong and I don't know. Women have been very supportive. I define sort of how I came to the work. Obviously, Jackson Katz was my mentor, and there were other men who were significant in teaching me about masculinity. But essentially, my work and the work of men in the field of men's violence against women is that I was asked by women to use my status and my privilege and all this football stuff, right? To use this platform to talk to other men about dismantling the privilege, dismantling patriarchy and misogyny and sexism. And that's always a precarious place to be in. And without the support of women, that this had a goal that was necessary. This had a goal that was tangible, and to be supported by women. Men aren't sitting around going, "Hey, Don, come talk to us about dismantling this, of this dismantling patriarchy." And so, or my identity, my very identity as a man, the very conversation is very indicting for men. And so, women have been essential and absolutely necessary in supporting my work and even my exploration of the conversation.
So along this, Don, I got a question on Facebook from Melinda here who asked, have you seen examples of aspirational masculinity? Examples that you can lift up and say, I see progress here, I see progress there. Where do you see
that? Not to embarrass you or turn it on you, my friend, but you are a version of that aspirational masculinity. No,
Hey, I did not pay Don before this, just so everyone knows. We didn't exchange that. I got to make sure. Yeah. I hope my mom and dad are watching this.
Right. So. Let's record. I think we have it. But it is, that's what inspires me. People like you and so many men, and there are so many more men out there that we don't hold up and we don't say, this is what healthy, whole, loving, caring masculinity looks like. It's not some mystery. It really isn't. Yeah. It's not getting, you don't lose anything. You just gain this whole a world that is more loving, more caring, more gentle. And at the same time, Brian, the work you do at a university with so many challenges, and you can just reflect on the past 6 months on that campus, so many challenges where you do have to be tough and strong and fight through some feelings. And that's courage. And be able to stand in front of people and speak truth to power and speak with a courageous voice around difficult issues. That to me is part of the toughness of masculinity, of humanity. But I think for men to be that and to also be loving and caring and empathetic and be courageous in the display of that, to me is what aspirational masculinity is. And I you embody that. And I don't mean to go back to the commercial, but there are so many men that you and I know. When we first held that meeting a couple of years ago on campus, we had 19 men come together, and they were all men who sat around talking about the relationship with their dads and their struggles of that kind of masculinity that we're talking about. That part to me is the aspirational side of masculinity.
I wonder, and thank you, Don, seriously, for your kind words.
Absolutely.
One of the conversations you and I had recently was, after going through your book, which I really love, I sat down with my own son, who's 9 years old now, and we had this powerful conversation, and where I sat with him and said, what does being a man look like to you? What does it look like to be a good man? And it was one of the more powerful conversations I've had with my own son, and I also had it with my daughter, who's 7 now, and asked her, what does it look like to be a good man? And I'm not sure if I would have had those conversations without our relationship and without your book. And how much I'm grateful for you for that. And I think about how do we have these conversations with our children? I think about in my own faith tradition, right? The book of Proverbs is about training our young people so that one day they will be old and they will know the path forward. And obviously in my role at the university, my roles as a parent and as a community member, how do you help parents to talk to their young children? What does that look? I'm sure I'm not the first person to ask you that question. Yeah. What does that look like to you as parents trying to speak to our sons and our daughters about what aspirational masculinity looks like?
I think that there's a real challenge for parents and our generation of parents who have kids, who are in grade school these days, because for many of us, we didn't have that model. My dad was a wonderful man. But, for my dad to say, I love you, it took humor or some drastic moment, if it even happened then. And I think one of the things that for a lot of parents, being vulnerable to their children is a great fear of what you don't know, or what you're afraid to talk with them about, what you're afraid to be honest with them about. And I've always defined sort of the work that I do is by talking about things that we've all been raised not to talk about. And so you find ways to skirt an issue, find ways to not talk about the reality of the frailty of our humanity very often. And that's the part that's tough for men in masculinity, is the frailty of our humanity. That's the most difficult. The vulnerability of our humanity is the most difficult to convey to boys, because all the messages that they're getting about being a healthy boy is being tough and being athletic, and being into those things that are tough and athletic, like sports. And so it's showing them the wholeness of, and I say the frailty and the vulnerability of our humanity, and just having that conversation and being able to say, I don't know. Let's discover together what this looks like. And because I wasn't raised that way, and that was before my parents passed away, it's been 3 years, almost 2.5 for my mom and 6.5 for my dad. And I was very adamant about talking to them about the things that they didn't talk to me about, that I struggled with, whether as a parent or just as a man coming into my own in so many different ways. And the things that I was now being asked to talk to, not just my children, but in general. When I go talk in schools and get those questions from students, you have to be able to give them, good information so that they can make good decisions and do it in a way that is respectful and in some cases tactful, because there are so many things that we still have not gotten very comfortable with in talking with young people. So I think the biggest thing that parents need to do is to kind of come clean on the things you don't know, or, and just say, what, that's a very good question, because I wasn't raised to have those comments. And I will tell you that, there are topics, the biggest one I think obviously is sex. And because they are exposed to so many different, very dysfunctional and troubling and harmful interpretations of what sex and relationships and intimacy looks like. And it's one that no generation has come clean on the realities and the truth of sexual behavior. And I think it's a really big one, because boys in particular are very, very susceptible to media interpretations of that is very troubling. And it's not just unhealthy for them in their relationships with their partners, but it's unhealthy for them in their relationships with themselves and how they see themselves as whole people.
Well, it's something that you talk about so wonderfully in your book, Don, is around performance, and you talk about performance, you talk about mandate, you talk about promise, and you talk about the lie. I love those 4 categories, if you will. In addition to talking a little bit about performance, would you mind sharing a little bit about the other pieces as well? I think for those that haven't read the book, and my hope is that we can put a link on our Facebook comment section so people know how to get the book. But for those that haven't read it, could you share a little bit more about that, please?
Sure. It begins with the mandate, and that's where you throw like a girl comes from, or be a man, right? Just to be a man, to suck it up, to man up. That's the mandate, which is a very, very hollow mandate. And the promise is, well, let me just go back to the performance. The performance is everything that comes after that, because then you start performing this really inauthentic version of self. And I think about, that moment that boys learn that their mom is less than, right? Well, I'll never forget, many years ago, many years ago, my nephew had on my mother's high heels. And the response from the men in the room and the women was, take those off, the homophobia, right? So automatically this performance of that, I was just doing that because it was my grandmom's, right? And all of a sudden there's this performance that I got to act tough, I got to perform. Women will say sometimes, why is my husband or my boyfriend, why is he so sweet when it's just the two of us, but when the guys come around, he becomes this jerk, right? He's performing for those guys. He's performing that. And the promise of masculinity is, as long as you perform that and perform it well, you're the man, you're clean, you're good, right? And so you're welcomed into the man club, right? You're welcome into that, into the privilege of patriarchy. And the lie is that that's all a lie. That does not make you a real man. And this is why, if you listen to grandfathers or you listen to older men who wish that they had said, I love you more, who wish that they had spent more time, who wish that they had cared more, who wish they didn't work as much. There's all these regrets of what masculinity asked of them to be a noble, good man. And yet it was a lie. It didn't make them better people. It didn't make them a more whole, complete man. And that's the lie, which is part of what gets into the blind spot of masculinity. And the blind spot, which is the subtitle of the book, the blind spot are all those things that we don't do as men because we don't have to. Part of our privilege as men is that we don't have to think about these issues. We don't have to think about gender. We don't have to think about so many, because we have privilege that doesn't ask us to do those things. And in that privilege, the blind spot is that we don't get better. And we don't model that more whole, loving example of whole aspirational masculinity for our boys. And we put our boys at a deficit because we don't have an honest conversation with them about what that means and what that looks like and how they're supposed to express themselves. And so that blind spot is ultimately the lie that masculinity has told men, that being tough and strong and not showing your emotions is what makes you a real man.
I was thinking a lot about this conversation for you and I thought about, you've probably been asked 50 of the same exact questions about this book, and I'm wondering, what's a question that nobody asks you that you wish they asked you?
So I'm laughing.
I'm going deep. 30 minutes into this. I'm going for it.
I want people to know that you warned me about this question, and it's been here the whole time. Because where I go to immediately when you ask that question, which was really too deep that I really wanted to get into, but the only thing that I can think of, and it was my first thought, and it's my only thought, and it's a hard one, is because there are many questions that I wish people would talk about more deeply, but I get very personal, and the question is, what do you struggle with? And I think part of where I talk, I'm a New Yorker, I talk very aggressively, I talk with my hands, and people often don't question me because I talk so forcefully, and I'm the guy on stage, right? Yeah. So I must know what I'm talking about. I'm the guy that the university hired to come in here and talk, and gosh, I struggle with so much. I was raised in that, going back to your point before about playing out of position, I was raised to be this guy. I was raised by a dad who was an amazing human being, who did not emote, who did not cry. He would literally hide with his emotions. He would leave the room. So you didn't see him anything more than this stoic individual. And so being able to live in that authenticity of my wholeness is what I struggle with. And I struggle with it all the time. There's to do the kind of work that I do, to get on planes and go through the grind and not eat healthy and not, all the things that I do that I know. By the way, this is where the blind spot of masculinity came from with my book. I was out in California at a conference, and a young man who I actually, because of doing a lecture at SMU, he was inspired by the work. Now he's involved in the work. And we were running from conference to a restaurant, I think, whatever. And I was talking. And I hadn't eaten all day. And he observed that. He said, you haven't eaten. I said, yeah, I know. I'm better when I'm ornery. He goes, is that a bit of a blind spot? You're talking about taking care of men and being healthy and whole and all that. And you haven't eaten all day. And, you're on a 3-hour time difference from New York. And he was right. The ways in which I wasn't taking care of myself, or I don't necessarily take care of myself, or the things that I don't always emote, I don't always deal with, it's still in there. And very often, because you're that guy, whether it's the football player or the guy who's had some success, people now call me an author, and I correct them and say I'm not an author, I just wrote a book. Because you're that guy, people don't recognize that you have struggles, that that you still struggle with a lot of things day to day. You still need to talk. I have a therapist. You still need to talk about things that trouble you and things that you need to express. And so, and I want to model that. I'm not afraid of it. And it's something that happens, that I deal with every day, and always reminding myself that I'm no better in knowing how to do these things. And I'm still on that path as well.
I got a question from Carla, who was asking, going back here about COVID-19 and around men who are in the home more than they're accustomed to, and how tempting it might be to be, on the one hand, grateful to learn more about what your partner may be doing that perhaps you passed over, but also tempting to perhaps be a little resentful for what you're saying about, wow, I'm pretty useless around here. So maybe as we're coming towards the end of our conversation, to bring it back to the obvious of the context that we find ourselves in, just some thoughts for men who might be struggling right now, who perhaps weren't struggling 4 weeks ago or 5 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago. Just some helpful thoughts, some hints, some advice about how it is we can get through this difficult time as men.
Yeah. I hate when I see people who are complaining about being, stuck with their families. And gosh, it's such a blessing. Take it as a blessing. See it as an opportunity to do something that you've never had the opportunity to do. And we're so busy worrying about, reopening and restarting, and everyone who has a reasonable understanding of this knows that there's not going to be normal again for a long time. This is not a temporary situation. This is a sea shift change in our culture that's going to have an impact generations. And I think men need to really take this time to think about those things, to think about, who am I without my job? Who am I in this household? Who am I in in my relationships? And take the time to have those bold and brave conversations, to really start to and even to ask the questions that, like you just asked me, what do you struggle with? What is it that you want to know about me from your family, the people around you, to help challenge who you are. I think that it's a blessing of a time if we take it and take advantage of the time to be with loved ones in a way that is not just a matter of trying to entertain each other or trying to avoid each other, but truly taking the time to get to know one another. And I think in particular for men, to see ourselves outside of our identity in the workplace.
Don, it's great to have this conversation with you. I'm reminded that with every loss, there's gain. With every gain, there's loss. And in this moment, I know that I'm always feeling like I'm at a gain when we can have these conversations. And as is the case with many around the country, you help us to look deep within and compel us to be the best version of ourselves. So I really want to thank you on behalf of the chapel, on behalf of the university. For those that joined us, again, I highly, highly recommend the book. It's called You Throw Like a Girl, The Blind Spot of Masculinity. It's on our Facebook comment sections. I highly recommend it. We thank you for joining us this evening. And of course, in the midst of all that we're going through, I hope that you are healthy and I hope that you are hopeful. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Don, once again. And to all, God bless you and have a great night. Thank you.